Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Professor Lisa Han's talk on Deepwater Alchemy Multispecies Intimacies at the Blue Frontier, hosted by Farm for Change, Climate, Ecopoetics, and Earth Justice Research Lab of the Institute of European American Studies. My name is Serena Chou, and I'm an Associate Research Professor of American Literature here at the Institute, and currently the chair of Farm for Change. For the past 3 to 4 years, FFC hosted more than 20 talks and events by speakers whose work has inspired our research activism in everyday relations with the more than human world. And Lisa's work is just one of them. Lisa Han is an assistant professor of media studies at Pitzer College in the Claremont College Intercollegiate Media Studies Field Group. Situated at the intersections of environmental media studies, critical ocean studies, and science and technology studies, Lisa's work is informed by dedication to social and environmental justice. Her book, Deepwater Alchemy, Extractive Mediation, and the Taming of Seafloor was published by the University of Minnesota Press 2024. In this book, she examines how media operation in deep ocean environments paved the way for extractive industries. Lisa also works as a reviewer for review co-edits for the Journal of Environmental Media and is an affiliate of the Humanities for the Environment, North America and Asia Pacific Observatory. So it is with great pleasure that we have Lisa Han with us this morning. Let's welcome Lisa.
Hi, everybody. 大家好. Thank you so much for having me here at Farm for Change and the Institute virtually. Thank you, Serena, for that introduction. It's really a pleasure to speak to you all, having met so many of you this past summer. I was actually very lucky to be able to visit Taipei and cross paths with a number of you at NCCU and Academy Sinica and other places. So it's really great to be here with you all today. So for my talk today, I am going to start by introducing my book project. So I'll kind of give a general overview first, and then the second half, I want to get deeper into 2 of my chapters in particular, where I am discussing what thinking with whales and other kinds of cetaceans has meant for me when it comes to this research. So that'll be more of the multi-species intimacies part of the talk. To start, I just wanted to offer a little bit of background on how I got to thinking about oceans and media. So in 2014, I moved to Santa Barbara for grad school, which was in UC Santa Barbara's Film and Media Studies program. And I found that living there was in itself an opportunity to foster a certain kind of embodied relationship to the sea. So there are whales off the central coast of California. There's humpbacks, there's gray whales, there's blue whales, over 30 species of whale and dolphin that can be spotted regularly in the Santa Barbara Channel. And in addition to whales, that area is also host to the remnants of some of the oldest offshore oil infrastructures ever established in the United States. And so when I started thinking about what I wanted to research for my dissertation, I wanted to think about those multi-sensory experiences of non-humans like whales in these industrialized environments. And I got into researching sonic media, in particular sound-based media technologies, as a way of thinking about our oceans as this shared multi-species space. And so from there, I slowly built the rest of the book. And today I've decided to kind of take you all back to those early interests. But before I get there, I'm going to kind of allow me to introduce some of the larger frameworks of the book. So when we talk about underwater media, I think most people probably think of things like nature documentaries. So maybe you've seen Blue Planet, or maybe you've seen something that James Cameron has made, like The Abyss or the Titanic. And although those are kinds of, those popular mediations of our seas are so influential, in my book, I'm really starting with this premise of ocean mediation through a really expansive understanding of what actually constitutes mediation in environmental media theory. And so that for me means going beyond the camera itself and taking into account these entire context zones and interfaces of deep sea underwater media assemblages. So the ocean itself, including seawater, including wastewater, underwater light, and sediment, all those things become a medium for a certain kind of cultural exhibition, a certain kind of development of a human-ocean relationality. I'm also looking at many multi-sensory technological objects, so things like samplers, sonar technologies, of course, and other kinds of sensors and infrastructures, as well as living organisms that get recruited into our technological assemblages as either sensors or obstacles. So that mode of thinking about deep sea media production is in dialogue with ideas from a number of different fields, including science and technology studies, eco-criticism, critical infrastructure studies, and elemental media studies in particular, which is a subfield of media studies that has taken environments, the question of environments and elements, very seriously in theorizing what it is to make and communicate information and meaning. So the environment in that perspective is very much more than just a background, right? It's an active participant and agent in media processes. I'm also in conversation with other research on energy and on human relationships to our oceans from the humanities. And so that might include folks like Jennifer Gabris and Etienne Benson, who have their books up here, who think about digital mediations of the planet, as well as people who look at media infrastructure, like Nicole Staroselsky, who writes about underwater cables, and then other ocean media theorists and historians, like Melody Ju, for instance, John Shiga, and Stefan Helmreich, just to name a few. So ultimately, my goal was really to look at oceanographic science as a socio-technological space. A lot of that then, for me, entailed archival research on the one hand, on the histories of oceanography, really digging into old documents about marine science and ocean data collection. I happened to be trained as a journalist before becoming an academic. And so beyond just reading the scholarship and looking through archives, I've often found it's very useful to just talk to people and be a part of those communities and attend conferences where there is a community of people sharing ideas that are relevant. And so I did a lot of that media ethnographic work as well. And for me, media ethnography as a humanities-based scholar is a way of studying the cultural context of ocean media production. So that includes site visits. And it's a perspective that I saw very underrepresented in a lot of these oceanographic spaces in the US context, which I was at, which tended to lean very heavily towards science engineering and at best science communication. So one of the things that I had to be very clear about as I was coming into the spaces as a media scholar is that actually I'm not a science communicator. My role is not simply to translate science into a digestible format, but actually to conduct cultural analysis on what scientists produce, to understand science as a culturally and historically situated practice. And so doing that allows us to, I think, better understand the challenges that oceanographic communities face. And I found really that people were very receptive to that when I was doing the research. So Deepwater Alchemy takes what I've seen in regards to how ocean scientists and engineers talk about ocean media technology and tries to articulate and problematize the outsized role that extractive industries like offshore oil and gas and seabed mining have had in dictating deep sea media development in our deep sea imaginaries. At its core, the book revolves around this paradox. So on the one hand, you have all of these innovative new media techniques that have been created to observe and gather data underwater about the deep sea. And those are partially driven by this urgent need to protect ocean environments, particularly in the wake of anthropogenic climate change. On the other hand, extractive industries that are actually directly contributing to environmental harm and degradation on a planetary scale are funding a large portion if not the majority, of deep sea research and technological development globally. Part of that is, of course, because of the huge expenses involved in actually doing deep sea research, right? Only a small number of players have the resources to do it. So the central intervention of the book is then a theory of extractive mediation, which I define as processes of environmental sensing, visualization, and datafication that fundamentally support extraction, or what I define as non-reciprocal acts of extraction, exploitation, and colonization. So for me, looking at extractive mediation starts with looking at the stories we tell ourselves about the deep ocean. Our dominant, like, Western cultural imaginary of the deep sea is determined by a very small set of media narratives. So one cluster, you could say, of narratives is our cultural imaginary of the deep sea as a very dangerous, perilous frontier. So that's both in fiction and in the history of oceanography itself. So if you think about, documentaries like Blue Planet, horror films like 47 Meters Down, James Cameron's The Abyss, and others, those movies have tended to exoticize deep sea space as this really extreme and dangerous and fathomless space. This here is an early example of that. It's from John Ernest Williamson, who is one of the first ocean filmmakers. And that has a lot to do with, on the one hand, the physical challenges involved in actually observing and creating images of the deep sea, right? So we've tended from a Western settler colonial perspective to think of the deep sea as a terra nullius or a terra incognito, or you could say aqua nullius or aqua incognito, which is to say that we've thought of it as this empty space on a map that needs to be filled out. So unlike the kinds of visual cultures that we associate with, like, the tropics, the shallows, the beaches, we've tended to think about this deep sea as a very extreme and alien and threatening space, precisely because it is so unknown. It's subject to a kind of othering that puts those ecosystems at a great risk, because in fact, they are incredibly fragile and they're not very resilient at all. And one of the aspects of my research that has, I think made one of the greatest impressions on me was when I went out and talked to deep sea ecologists who were explaining to me all the species they had discovered, right, in the deep sea. And they were also emphasizing that the deep seabed is one of the least resilient ecosystems on the planet because it is so slow moving and slow remote, right? So the kinds of disturbances that you might see from mining, from drilling, and from other kinds of industrial activity, those are extra catastrophic to the organisms living in the deep sea. And that harm is very widespread and large scale because, we're in a fluid environment. So the other narrative impulse, or the one that I begin the book with, is what I describe as a desire to turn sea into land, or more specifically, to turn our knowledge and relationship to the deep seas into a format that resembles the knowledge that we have of terrestrial spaces. And so I see different iterations of that fantasy of transforming fluid into solid, which to me is a kind of metaphorical alchemy. That's kind of the title of my book. And so as one group of deep sea marine geologists puts it, the fantasy is to pull the plug on the oceans, to drain the water from 70% of the Earth's surface hidden beneath the waves. I just love this visual as a depiction of that. So remote sensing, all these technologies, things like remote sensing, underwater videography, they participated in opening up new ideas about the deep sea as this potentially functional and stable space for human existence, and most importantly, for human profit. And that has contributed to speculative plans and imaginaries for everything from seafloor museums to entire seafloor civilizations. Especially now, the deep seabed has in many ways become this speculative replacement for land. They feed into the funding of, those narratives, they feed into the funding of scientific and engineering initiatives and into governance around deep sea extraction. Most pressingly, the confluence of climate change, the geopolitical conflict that we see over dwindling oil and mineral reserves on land, and the discovery of mineral resources at the seafloor means that the deep ocean's visibility is highly consequential to how humanity is planning for its future. So a major motivating force for this is, of course, the desire to obtain and control energy resources. Deep sea drilling is expanding, and technologies like windmills, solar panels, electric vehicles, our computational devices, a lot of those depend on the mining of rare earth minerals. So that includes manganese, nickel, cobalt, copper, and other resources that also happen to be at the seafloor. So Norway recently became, I believe, the first country to approve moving forward with deep sea mining, despite the existence of widespread warnings by environmental scientists. Even more recently, President Trump in the United States signed an executive order authorizing deep sea mining in international waters. And so those leaps to deep sea mining are, essentially at odds with international law, specifically the UN Law of the Sea, which is an organization comprised of a coalition of 167 nations based in Kingston, Jamaica, and that does not include the United States. And so as a result, the deep sea has become this terrain of geopolitical contestation, and the development of deep sea media technologies, even before that, is entangled into all of these existential hopes and fears for humanity. So the title of my project, Deepwater Alchemy, is sort of intended to signal those hopes and desires. For me, the word alchemy connects deep sea mediation to the alchemy of the 16th century and people who theorize the existence of an elemental substance or prima materia that would act as a new realm of possibility for the increase of human wealth. This later becomes known as the Philosopher's Stone. And so I use that as a figure for thinking about how the resources of the deep sea are being mediated. I draw from religious studies, from historical accounts of alchemy, to make this case that just as 16th century alchemy was woven into a certain history of European imperial expansionism and these ideas of human conquest over nature, undersea media expansion today is inextricable from those same ecologies of empire. It's something that's always sort of been animated by a certain desire to transform that which is fluid into something solid, right? Water into gold, the desire to transform knowledge of the sea into terms that resemble knowledge of the land and ultimately for profit. So each of my chapters explores a different instance of what I see as extractive mediation. And I sort of try to embrace this oceanic temporality in the structure of the book. So that means thinking about present pasts and also futures present. The term present past, I borrow from a scholar named Andreas Heissen, whose work on futures of memory provided such a spark for me when I initially started to think about things like the ocean as this ancient space and the role of historicity in deep sea extractivism. And so reflecting on that, I start chapter 1 with shipwrecks. I talk about lost futures and how shipwreck salvage expeditions reconfigure the seabed as both a resource frontier and an archive of human technological innovation. One of the interventions I pose in chapter 1 is that the blue archive and the blue frontier, they're really two sides of the same coin, because the idea of the seafloor as an archive is itself also mediated as a resource frontier, while resource frontiers in the deep sea are talked about in terms of common heritage. And there's two examples that I refer to. There's some American examples. I talked a little bit about the Titanic, but I also talked about some Chinese examples too. The kind of imaginary of the maritime Silk Road and Nanhai No. 1 and the shipwreck salvage expeditions that have gone on the other side of the Pacific. I then dig into present futures and the speculative modes that inform offshore prospecting. So chapter 2, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about today, is called Swimmers in a Sonic Pipeline, and that charts the history of petroleum surveys. Chapter 3, Perilous Plumes, is the deep sea mining chapter. So that one looks at the wastewaters and turbulent plumes that are produced by deep sea mining and thinks about the research around that and the ways that we mediate ideas of risk and hazard and precaution through these various attempts to model and map and visualize the spread of those toxic plumes. And then the last two chapters end with, I think, ideas of deep sea futurities that are also past. So these are reversals to what we've imagined before, but we kind of think of them as future-oriented. So chapter 4 is entitled Ocean Pacemakers, and that traces a portion of the history of whale telemetry and tagging, which I'll talk a little bit more about today too. And then chapter 5 picks up where chapter 4 leaves off to consider the politics of environmental witnessing and speculation when it comes to seafloor observatories. And so in that chapter, I'm looking at fiber optic cabled infrastructures. And I end up digging into the infrastructural maintenance work and social media accounts of different oceanographic expeditions, where we really see those interspecies frictions and collaborations that are encountered by deep sea maintenance workers, the people who are out there fixing the fiber optic cables that we all rely on for internet. So to give you a little bit more insight into some of this, I'm going to now take a deeper dive into what I think of as the whale chapters of the book. So that's chapter 2, Swimmers in a Sonic Pipeline, which is more of a historical chapter, and then chapter 4, Ocean Pacemakers, which is a little bit more contemporary. All right, so one of my more straightforward case studies for extractive mediation is the petroleum survey, which I examine as a particular kind of systematic media practice that has been a major driver for the development of deep ocean mediation in a number of different realms. It's something that has impacted everything from archaeology to popular mediations of the sea, in addition to this particular context. So in the chapter, I critique the seismic survey in particular, and this sort of ongoing emphasis on a desire for ocean transparency and comprehensive coverage by thinking about the violent and explosive underpinnings of offshore petroleum methods. I point out the ways that they are erasing the ocean's materiality, and in doing so, producing death and injury to marine life on a very large scale. That chapter is organized in terms of 3 kinds of extraction, or takes, as I call them, which is a bit of a play on words, because it has meaning in both the marine industries context and in the film and media studies context. So the first take is the intake of resources, so specifically in this instance, petroleum. The second is the media sense of the word take that we associated with repeated attempts at imaging. First take, second take, third take. And that specifically refers to the ways that modern techniques in petroleum seismology require the use of explosions that are repeated hundreds of times for days, for weeks, and even for months to achieve a certain breadth and precision that is desired. I'm going to kind of explain a little bit more about how that works in a bit. And the third take is what it is called the incidental take, which is a formal term used in the marine industries to describe collateral death or the accidental killing of marine life. So in industrial attempts to facilitate a certain type of signal, a certain type of knowledge about the seafloor, and to eliminate noise, there's been a teleological pruning of sound through the history of offshore oil prospecting that is made invisible. And so to the extent that sounding, processes of sounding, construct communication feeds that cut out ocean ecologies, I describe those surveys as sonic pipelines. They're sort of a first step in an extractive value chain that also then includes ultimately the creation of pipelines for oil. And so next I'm going to take you a brief tour on some of the technical history of seismic survey development, where we see this progressive construction of pathways for information and for oil at the expense of other kinds of ocean materiality. So bear with me because I'm going to kind of, I think, get into the nitty-gritty of the history a little bit. Okay. So during the post-war period, oil production in the United States ramped up significantly because of the increased demand, of course, in the years of World War II, where oil access is equated with national well-being. So in the mid-1940s, you had all these companies like Union Oil, Company of California, Signal Oil, Shell Oil, Mako Corporation. They're all experimenting with techniques for geophysical surveys in the Santa Barbara Channel and around the central coast of California. And although you had offshore drilling and core sampling before this, the 1940s is when serious milestones start happening. And it's in part because they start to get more development of oil wells in the Gulf of Mexico, so out of sight from land. And with that comes underwater media development. So there's this movement to find techniques that could provide detailed, continuous information about the seafloor, unlike something like grab sampling, where you're just kind of getting intermittent information. So a relatively low-tech example of this was a device called the Soundfish, which I thought was very interesting. This was developed by the US Navy Electronics Lab in the 1940s for geophysical prospecting. So the Soundfish consisted of a hydrophone encased in a metal container, which could then be dragged along the bottom of the ocean. And frictional noises from the scraping of the metal cylinder on the seafloor would then be picked up by the hydrophone, and it would be sent to an amplifier on the towing vessel. So that provided sort of semi-continuous information about the seabed. I kind of like to think of it as playing telephone with the ocean floor. It's almost like using hydrophones as a proxy for not just ears, but human fingertips. So the Soundfish assumes a subject position in which the oceanographer is this ideal ear who is responsible for filtering and interpreting information, sensory information about the seafloor's composition, and discerning things like what is mud, what is rock, and what is sand. And you can kind of see it in this quote here. So this is from a group of Navy researchers. They say, rock makes continuous loud bongs or clangs, sand makes a heavy scraping or rasping noise, and mud makes a quiet swishing noise. It is necessary for the observer to train his ear by listening while the equipment is being dragged at constant speed over known types of bottom, as determined by grab sampling. And so individual ears have to be trained and have to be calibrated to these highly qualitative sensory inputs. The problem is that, like, during this time, and just to backtrack a little bit, so during this time, and especially the decades following the Titanic shipwreck disaster in 1912, most oceanographers were all about trying to avoid the bottom of the ocean. Depth was this sort of terrifying thing. And it's something that you actually see in oceanographic archives in expedition reports. This is a quote from the director of Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, which is based out in Massachusetts, this Columbus Eastland, who got frustrated. He was getting frustrated with the entanglement of marine animals around his hydrographic wires. And he says, quote, if the submarine devils are not interfering with the work, the devils of stormy weather are very apt to seize the opportunity to persecute the sleepy oceanographer. So it's not a very charitable description of marine life. I think it's very antagonistic towards these submarine devils, right? So there's still all of this anxiety around the seafloor as a dangerous alien space. And people wanted to have a certain amount of control and access, but at a distance. And that's why the invention of echo sounding was so important, right? So echo sounding essentially works similarly to echolocation. World War II and the German U-boat menace provided a huge drive for this development in the US Navy context. So in 1924, there's a Navy physicist named Harvey Hayes who invents this device called the sonic depth finder, which is a new technology for imaging the ocean bottom using sound. And that was praised for turning on, as they put it, a sonic light on the dark ocean depths. So as a form of echo sounding, this kind of then leads me to petroleum seismology. Petroleum seismology is a form of echo sounding. It similarly involves producing a series of loud acoustic sounds that hit the seafloor and then echo back to a set of transducers, which then translate those sound waves into information, electrical signals about the seafloor structures. A byproduct of this, however, was that everything between the target, which is the seafloor, and the receiver at the surface is increasingly seen as noise. So that noise could include wind, it could include traffic, could include marine animals, or statics or variable surface conditions that could obscure or distort the sound reflection measurements. So they weren't getting the clearest images, right? So what's the answer to noise? As it so happens, the answer to noise was the production of more noise. The ocean is a very sonic world, right? Sound is the principal way in which organisms under the ocean communicate. So to create stronger signals, surveyors found they had to use louder sound sources. And specifically, they began appropriating military weapons for acoustic communication. So that meant explosives, things like dynamite and substances like PETN, which was used by the Germans in World War I, were and continue to be an important component of oceanographic surveys. So this is what's called explosion seismology. And that quickly becomes a proven tool for the location of marine hydrocarbons. So that method was popularized by a physicist named Maurice Ewing, who first used TNT or dynamite to study the continental shelf for the US Coast and Geodetic Survey, which is a civilian and scientific agency responsible for surveying the US coastline. So you see this throughout the history of oceanography, right? There's a technology that starts out in the military and then becomes a civilian technology. And that's sort of what we see here also. So later on, Ewing's student, this guy's student, John Brackett Hersey, goes on to work on a seismic exploration crew for Phillips Petroleum. And then Hersey is later hired to run an underwater acoustics program for WHOI, for Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, where he coupled newer explosive sources with hydrophone techniques to create this continuous seismic profiler, which is a technique that consisted of towing instruments behind a ship and then repeating the echo sounding process several times per minute. What that did, having that repetitive, those repetitive explosions, is that it introduces a time-based understanding of resolution. It's kind of like the transition from photography to moving images, right? And so by the 1960s, CSP is used almost universally for offshore oil exploration. So there have been other innovations since. In the 70s, Lamont and manufactured Bolt Technologies and Texas Instruments pioneered the use of air guns, which are towed from survey ships and use blasts of pressurized air as a sound source. That's kind of seen as more environmentally friendly than just bombs, right? But then later, after Shell Oil first discovers the first deepwater oil field in 1975, that's the Cognac field in the Gulf of Mexico, people like Hersey start really anticipating the need for better survey techniques that can provide images with near photographic detail for deepwater petroleum and for hard mineral interests. And that meant developing things like ocean bottom seismographs, which essentially place both the explosions and the receivers or the hydrophones at the seafloor. So that offers more direct forms of sound penetration. So looking into this, I ended up going to WHOI and interviewing a researcher there who led a project in 1990 called the Near Ocean Bottom Explosive Launcher, or NOBEL for short. It's the first imaging system to detonate multiple high explosive charges at the seafloor using military grade pentolite. So he just essentially threw a bunch of bombs right to the bottom of the seafloor. And as he put it to me, the results we got were extraordinary. It'd be like, I used to study the moon with binoculars in a lounge chair in my backyard, and now I'm standing there. That's the leap in resolution. So being a media scholar, I thought that language was very interesting, right? He's essentially saying, the bigger the bomb, the better the picture, the better the image fidelity. So all this is to say that the information that we've acquired about the ocean floor, the techniques that we've created to see the seabed, are so caught up in this pursuit of resources and the pursuit of high fidelity. And the question then is, what does that leave out? So returning to the actual violent bangs, the sonic bangs of seismic surveys, forces us to think about non-human formations and those differential experiences of things like noise, light, and other forms of pollution from mediation in the ocean, from the perspective of marine animals. And so in close proximity, something like the physical shock from seismic blasting travels faster than the acoustic velocity of an explosive. That means it hits you physically before you hear it. That means that animals that are close to a blast can experience immediate deafening, immediate hearing impairment, while fish eggs and larvae can be killed by the explosive pulses on the spot. That's close by. Further away, those sounds interfere with aquatic life forms that depend on sound to find food, to mate, and also to escape predators. So even air guns, which are believed to be more humane than traditional explosives, are harmful. And this might be really loud, so prepare yourself. So I'm just going to show you clip of what an air gun sounds like. So a 2017 study on air guns similarly showed adverse impacts to organisms like zooplankton and larval krill, which are, of course, so important to the ocean food chain. And then that says nothing of non-human affects like fear, anxiety, stress, and confusion that are experienced by animals like whales. And so for whales, if you're a whale, hearing air guns is roughly like hearing gunshots in a sequence. And we know that whales and other cetaceans are affected by this. So researchers have seen things like changes in vocal behaviors, increased levels of norepinephrine, epinephrine, dopamine, and also aldosterone in dolphins and white whales. So all those things are signs of stress. So this is all part of an overall increase in noise in our oceans that also includes things like shipping noise and Navy sonar. And those impacts on whales have been very well documented. They're also getting much worse. So again, in 2018, during the first Trump administration, seismic airgun surveys were approved in the Atlantic by oil and gas companies, which once again jeopardized efforts to protect endangered species like the North Atlantic right whale, which I think there are only maybe 300 of those whales left. Now, of course, we have even more regulatory challenges, right? In the United States, we've overturned Chevron deference. So that used to require the courts to defer to federal agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency to interpret ambiguous laws. We no longer have that protection. And so a lot of these efforts to protect these key sanctuaries from industrial activity are really in danger today. A closer look at this cartography of sonic force, as Steve Goodman would call it, and how it materially affects marine ecology is problematizes our tendency to center human perception and human values in the process of imaging. So whales and cetaceans perceive the world through these large auditory organs that can determine things like sizes, shapes, speeds, and textures of objects. They navigate, hunt, and they also form social groupings primarily through echolocation. Toothed whales don't hear through an eardrum and transduction through the middle ear like humans do. They rather hear through these fatty tissues on their head and jaws, which connect sound vibrations to their inner ear via an acoustic funnel. So it's a very haptic, it's a very touch-oriented way of hearing. Many technological solutions are still being built from a very anthropocentric perspective. So current seismic activities are made to stop when whales are spotted 56 miles from the blast site. But what does that mean in an environment where sound can travel as far as 2,000 miles, right? Sound travels very differently underwater than it does in air. And it means very little, as it turned out. Other mitigation efforts revolve around things like warning blasts or shell crackers. So that's using noise to mitigate noise. Some people have recommended the use of soft starts, where you kind of increase the loudness of sound gradually over periods of 20 minutes or more. So essentially, it's an induction of fear responses that is normalized as an environmentally friendly solution. And this isn't me kind of saying like we shouldn't use any of these strategies, but what's interesting is that essentially, what is a weapon in one context, typically a human context, becomes a sustainable technology in another, right? Another thing is that these technologies do very little to distinguish between different species. Sort of like one fish can be substituted for another. So building on some work in sound studies, specifically by Steve Goodman and J. Martin Daughtry, who talk about vibrational sound, I consider here an expanded sense of what they term bellophonic sound, which typically refers to sounds of war. So we can think about that beyond human pain, turning instead to the affective and physical action on non-human subjects. So something like shell crackers and seal bombs, they bear some resemblance to the deployment of sound cannons or long-range acoustic devices. So these are sound devices, sound weapons that are used to control bodies and crowds in the event of a protest in a human world, typically. And I want to show you another view of a seismic survey. So this is a scene filmed and uploaded to YouTube by a user in 2013 under the title "Hearing Seismic Surveying While Underwater." So the caption tells us the sounds are coming from a Turkish ship called the Barbaros, which the videographer is saying is illegally breaching the territorial waters of Cyprus to conduct seismic surveys. And this might be on a bit more quiet. You can kind of hear it just then. There it is again, right? Right, sort of. I don't know how you would describe that. So I'll just kind of talk over it while it's playing. I spent hours scouring the internet for recordings of seismic surveys, and this is one of the few video recordings that I was able to find of a live seismic survey from an underwater perspective. And I was really struck by how simple the video is. It's unedited. It's this kind of visual document, audiovisual document. Also, I was struck by how immediately people were able to think about the fish perspective in it. So if you look at the comments of the video, a lot of people can't help but imagine how the fish feel. They talk a lot about how scary it is. They speculatively place the sounds into a horror film. And by contrast, the internet is saturated with industry media that merely animates or produces these highly edited videos of the seismic survey process. Some of that educational material even goes so far as to edit in extraneous footage of fetal ultrasounds to explain sound imaging. You can kind of see it here, right? Seismic surveys, which are like ultrasounds of the Earth that help scientists see below the ocean floor. And so that was one of, what I found kind of a very culturally and symbolically loaded greenwashing strategy around seismic surveys. Organizations like the American Petroleum Institute have fostered this very gentle, maternalistic, innocuous idea of seismic surveys with that ultrasound reference where oil, similarly to a fetus, is validated as a cultural object. Watching that other video and thinking about the positionality of the hunter who is empathizing with his quarry also then made me think about a conversation I had with a North Atlantic right whale hormone researcher based at the New England Aquarium named Elizabeth Burgess. So Burgess started out in 2005 as a contracted marine mammal observer for the New Zealand's Crown Minerals, which is, in fact, she was one of the very first dedicated marine mammal observers for seismic surveys in New Zealand. And she explained to me that her job at the time was to spot whales and then notify surveyors when to halt operations to avoid harming nearby whales. At that time, it was just basically done by eye and with goggles. And she remembers that as a pivotal experience that led her to realize a need for more research on the impacts of things like noise on whales. And so, not unlike the spear fishermen, I think Burgess's proximity to marine life through extractive industry actually enabled her to develop a sense of care for those whales. And so thanks to people like her today, right, there's better techniques now for whale spotting, such as audio observation. That has also proliferated observer programs on petroleum survey ships. So after I wrote this chapter, I started to reflect more on the ways that whales have become these iconic symbols of environmentalism that are perceived as exceptional and intelligent and therefore worth protecting. The history of human-whale relationships is this complex interplay of interspecies exploitation and empathy, in which whales have sometimes played the victim, as with the seismic survey story, and sometimes played the collaborator in media technological development. And that's the part that I want to talk about next. So there's a historian named D. Graham Burnett who proposes that at the height of the 1960s, 1970s Western environmentalist movement, there's a, quote, shift to view these creatures as possessed of intelligence, defined loosely as cognitive and affective abilities recognizable to human beings as sufficiently like our own to disqualify them as a prey species. Indeed, other anthropologists like Arne Collin have gone so far as to characterize a certain kind of cetacean exceptionalism as a form of totemization, where attributes of multiple whale species are combined in our imaginaries to create this really mythical portrait of a biologically, ecologically, culturally exceptional super whale. So the point kind of is that humans see whales as smart. We see them as human-like and therefore worth protecting. But what really are the terms by which we're defining their value and their intelligence? That's where my second case study comes in. Today we have these data collecting tags attached to marine mammals via things like suction cup or implantation that produce a tag-along perspective on seas that allow us to see, not only observe whales, but to understand the oceans from the perspective of whales, reframing these animal-born sensors as extensions of human technological agency. So through tagging and satellite telemetry, whales are then positioned as these ambassadors and assets to an emerging global ocean monitoring system. So many marine mammal researchers see in something like biotelemetry this ultimate end goal of a global one-stop shop for ocean data, or an aquatic Amazon, so to speak, where a large range of information about marine megafauna and their habits is freely accessible and available to researchers in standardized, integrated data formats. And so in this way, whales and other large marine mammals now participate in media assemblages as co-producers of a quote unquote smart ocean and ultimately a smart planet. So I want to kind of dig into that language a little bit of smartness. This is something that is talked a lot about in digital media studies. So Ori Halpern, Robert Mitchell, and James Bridle, among others, have argued that smartness, like smart technology, is not a neutral label, but is rather woven both culturally and technologically into the fabric of our society. So Bridle argues, for instance, in his book, Ways of Being, that the idea of artificial intelligence, for instance, is largely based on what humans do and is also tied to a corporate context. And so knowing this, right, through interviews and archival research about tagging, I wanted to think about the kinds of cultural values that inform something like marine mammal telemetry as a smart technology. And I was interested in historicizing the tag and including in that story the terrestrial technologies that similarly engage in passive forms of mobile data collection. So again, a quick history bit. Historically, the study of whale movements is a specialty found among whalers and mariners, so people who had a direct stake in being able to predict the movements of whales. So you had hunters, looking for spermaceti, sperm oil, whale bone, whale oil, who all kind of acquired specialized knowledge and skills about their quarry and also recorded their observations about whale sightings in logbooks. But for others, whale lives are really far less accessible to humans. If you think about the industry of whale watching, tourists are traveling very far and wide to pay for boats just to glimpse, a tail flip or a back fin, or if we're lucky, a chance to see whales feeding or breaching or communicating. So in popular media about whales, it's really commonplace to see language about acquiring sneak peeks into the lives of these secretive animals, whether the context for that is mediation through images taken by scientists, or things like marine mammal theme parks that promise these public up-close views through aquarium windows or live cams. And so scientific tagging and telemetry technologies are kind of a part of this. In one recent example, there was all this media attention that arose. I'll just kind of see if I can read this real quick. That arose around this GoPro-like footage that was taken by cameras attached to whales with suction cups by the University of British Columbia's Marine Mammal Research Unit, which allows viewers to take a ride, as if on the back of an orca. And those images have brought whale social lives into greater focus, right? It displays family bonds. You see their feeding behaviors that were previously unknown, as well as giving researchers a way of following and collecting whale data. Now, doing that is not a simple thing. So whales, tagging a whale is not like tagging other animals. A whale cannot be clipped. It cannot be fitted with adhesives or glue the way that elephants are. It can't be banded like a bird. And so a whale's body is this like smooth, really streamlined shape that's also very large. And it's also hard to catch a whale, right? So they usually have to be tagged while they're in motion. And so because of all those challenges, that the research on tagging whales lagged behind the research on tagging terrestrial animals. So we started tagging terrestrial animals during the Cold War. Whale tagging starts being explored in the 1960s and the 70s, which is a history that Etienne Benson traces a portion of in his book, Wired Wilderness. In 1987, there's a Marine Mammal Commission workshop which gathered to discuss satellite telemetry in particular and its potential to aid the protection of endangered whales from offshore oil and gas development, as well as fishing and shipping. So it's a conversation kind of connected to the first part of the talk, which was about seismic blasting. And in a 1988 annual report to Congress, cetacean tracking workshops sponsored by the Minerals Management Service and organized by the Marine Mammal Commission are discussed at length, concluding that tracking radio tagged whales from satellites is where the research needs to go. That ends up informing the design of transmitting tags at Oregon State University, where researchers were experimenting to develop workable tags for wild whales. So today we have those tags, and they inform everything from habitat models, which have like a range of oceanographic and industrial applications. So on the one hand, yes, it can be used to protect key areas for whales, bolstering cases for environmental protection. They can also have industrial applications, right? They might help companies site new infrastructure and conduct environmental impact assessments using habitat models or cetacean forecasts for logistics. There's two kinds of underwater tags for these animals. So you have archival tags on one hand and or temporary tags. So this is usually like a suction cup or clamp method that are meant to fall off the animal and then be gathered up later. And then you have implanted tags, which transmit data packages to satellites. That's the one on the right here. So the limitation of implanted tags is that they only transmit when above water, and they're also limited by power and bandwidth. So that reduces the amount of data that they can send. And they also limit their use to air-breathing species like whales. So to gain some insight into this, as well as that history, I spoke to Dr. Daniel Palacios, who is the current lead researcher of the Whale Habitat Ecology and Telemetry Lab at Oregon State University. And he told me this fascinating story, which I'll recount to you. So as an undergraduate student in Bogota, Palacios met and started working with a man named Jorge Reynolds, who was this eccentric engineer who gained prestige through his groundbreaking contributions to pacemaker technology. So that's a technology of the human heart. Reynolds began thinking about applying his knowledge of pacemakers to animals. What would it take to produce an electrocardiogram of an Amazon River dolphin? Or how about for a humpback whale? So that questioning then led Reynolds to form a team of industrial design students, electronics engineers, and biologists, affectionately calling them the Whale Heart Satellite Tracking Team, or WHIST for short. So Reynolds' experience in medicine dictated his journey into telemetry. Right? Like pacemakers for your heart, they're similar to tags. They're portable devices that measure biological variables. So in interviews, Reynolds really emphasized that poetic sense of kinship he felt working with both whale hearts and human hearts. Whale hearts, while obviously very large, are similar in structure to our own. And the idea of listening to the hearts of animals conveyed a kind of ethos of care and closeness that mirrored his sentiments to human patients. So in 2015, the King of Hearts, as New Scientist once called him, reflected on his career interest in the beating hearts of giants, musing, quote, "I think I have contributed to the whale, not as a spectacle, but as a creature which lives for the benefit of mankind." A very human-centric statement, to be sure, but it's also, I think, interestingly suggestive of the sense of empathy or intimacy and importance he felt in making that human-whale connection. So that idea of the heartbeat has stuck with us as an environmental imaginary. There's an organization called the International Cooperation for Animal Research Using Space, or ICARUS, which mobilizes Argo satellite systems for tracking tagged animals. And they also use that language. They describe their animal sensor network as a pulse of the living planet. So for ICARUS, the beating hearts of giants connects human empathy for the living to this more than living heart or pulse of the oceans and the earth as a whole. And you've probably heard maybe versions of like an embodied perspective on the planet before, right? Some people talk about the lungs of the ocean, or sorry, the oceans as the lungs of the planet. But again, that language of the pulse, I think, is very much connected to a data-oriented technological mediation of the Earth. So what kinds of human-whale intimacies does tagging enable? Well, as the Reynolds story shows us, right, there's an aspect of tagging that is very intimate. But I argue that the kind of human-whale intimacies that we see mediated through history by technologies like seismic imaging or marine mammal tagging is actually not this like uncomplicated, mutually beneficial relation. And as post-colonial scholars such as Lisa Lowe have argued, the entanglements of intimacy and benefit cannot be decoupled from histories of exploitation and colonization. So I understand intimacy with whales as a condition of both precarity and possibility. It's a kind of lopsided closeness that also might include violence, exploitation, and voyeurism, in addition to empathy and friendship. Hugo Reinert, who is a cultural historian of nature, has described telemetry as a, quote, constitutive withdrawal, not abandonment, but rather the opposite, a powerful and highly productive investment, which through its paradoxical absent presence offered a solution of sorts to the double bind. And so this idea of being both absent presence, right? Being present, but also absent, allows us to maintain, again, on the one hand, a fantasy of control at a distance, right? To kind of bring it back to what I was talking about before with echo sounding. But it also allows us to maintain a certain fantasy of, I think, untouched nature and pristine wilderness that is separate from us, separate from man, yet still accessible to us through mediation. But the prioritization of human concerns in cetacean telemetry, the way it's used to map movement ecologies and site infrastructure, suggests that inevitably the whaleness of that data, along with the agential capacities of the whale, will not be entirely archivable. So while the love of whales maybe helps inspire cetacean telemetry advancements, the sort of image of the exceptionally special smart whale is ultimately replaced with a much more abstractable notion of data points. That is to say, this transformation of cetacean bodies into signal platforms has important cultural implications in shifting the focus away from our identification with whales and towards this desire for global data coverage, transparency, accessibility, interoperability, and access and control over oceanic space. So it bears mentioning that this, I think, efficiency and miniaturization in telemetry is very much influenced by human mobile media technology. So our phones provide the template for mobile surveillance and a digitally mediated control society. It's a liquid power. It simultaneously entails a kind of shift into biopolitical frameworks. So one way that I think about it is that life in this assemblage, it ceases to be a binary concept that is tied to biological death, but rather enters into new realms of signification with the added connotations of signal transmission. So whale life becomes entangled into the life of the signal, and those two heartbeats don't always overlap. The whale as a reporter has to be understood as a subject with a lifespan that is more than biological. I think a queer ecological approach to understanding tags is to consider a paradigm which would take seriously this intertwining of biological death with signal deaths, as with the case of the telemetry tag that stops signaling on a whale, or the tag that keeps working even when the whale is dead. And so as we bring whales into this kind of global surveillance system, tagged whales become essential workers. They're as exploitable as an Amazon employee within this imagined aquatic Amazon, derived from the dreams of knowing the hearts of Amazon river dolphins. So what would human-ocean relationships look like if we're to submit ourselves to the mentorship of whales rather than only view them as tools or obstacles? As media objects, the tag plays this consequential role in dictating which marine matters constitute an oceanic pulse, or pulse of the planet. And more broadly, they draw boundaries about what matters to us about the ocean and its inhabitants. I think for all these limitations that I'm talking about here, something like telemetry can help us reflect on how we organize and interpret knowledge about the world and how we imagine ourselves in it. There was one recent, in 2019, there's a telemetry project tracking blue whale migrations, which showed that whales, quote, surf the green wave, which is to say that they time their migrations with resource waves in order to maximize their gain. And that discovery was really big because it transformed our understanding of whale memory. We learned that they rely on long-term memory to track shifting resources. So what if we were to take something like surfing and long-term memory as this kind of conceptual basis for our relationship to environmental resources, rather than the extraction that we have today? That would entail a mode of gathering knowledge and resources that is intergenerational, right, that is spatially enacted, that is also ecologically connected. So whale subjectivities, which fuse empathy and intelligence, both contribute to and challenge the anthropocentrism that lies at the core of the Western world's idolization of certain charismatic species like cetaceans over others, like the life in the deep sea that we mostly think of as monstrous. So insights like surfing the green wave work against these dominant tendencies that we have to fixate on human exceptionalism, biological limitation, or technological augmentation, which are all ideas that I think lead to understandings of whales as human-like, and also reaffirm this idea that humans are these intrepid underwater pioneers. And so much of what we've historically imagined ocean mediation relies on this very ableist paradigm of fitness and augmentation, and it ignores things like the mass disablement of whales. So I think what both scientific and humanities-oriented studies of whale perception do is help dismantle these existing hierarchies of knowledge and sense and bring us towards novel understandings of things like distributed sense, distributed intelligence, and also agency. And I'll end here. Here we have an image of an orca sinking a yacht, which was some of you may have seen this moment that went viral on social media here in the US. It became kind of a symbol of class struggle. And it was a really interesting moment to me because it's an example of a kind of imagined interspecies solidarity. So by submitting ourselves to a mentorship of whales, we can question our tendencies to separate our networked information cultures from empathy and kinship, and also in the process build perhaps a more ethical offshore humanism. When we attune ourselves to multi-species and interspecies solidarities through ocean observing, we may yet find hope and possibility in connecting our hearts to the beating hearts of much larger bodies, whether cetacean or celestial. And I will end it there. Thank you all very much for listening.